Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to have the opportunity to present this joint work. So the broad question this paper attempts to address is whether or not monetary policymakers should consider the income distribution when setting policy. We've noticed growing calls for central bankers to address rising inequality in the popular press, sort of an explosion of research interest in this topic. And we don't think of, caring about inequality or the income distribution as in any way being sort of traditional monetary policy. So at a high level, what do we think is driving these calls? Well, we sort of see two related facts. First, there's a lot of empirical evidence, growing literature, showing that how you fare over the business cycle really depends on your position in the income distribution. So in particular, those at the bottom of the income distribution are going to have a much tougher time during a recession. And in that way, inequality is kind of maybe moving at a pace that is too fast for fiscal policymakers to address it. So inequality is moving at a business cycle frequency, but fiscal policy, we usually think, only changes at a slower frequency. So maybe inequality is moving too fast for fiscal policymakers. And at the same time, there's all this research suggesting that monetary policy has a distributional impact. So you can think of these two facts together as maybe there's a need for monetary policy to step in when fiscal policy can't, and maybe monetary policy has some ability to change things, to change the income distribution. But even if you accept these two facts, which I think are still controversial, but even if you accept them, theory really isn't clear on exactly what to do and how taking into account the income distribution changes monetary policy trade-offs. Obviously, the new Keynesian model has a representative agent. That's the tool most of us use to think about monetary policy. With a single agent, you don't have any notion of inequality, obviously. There's been this recent Hank literature that's made a lot of progress on this question. They've implicitly or explicitly put heterogeneity into the new Keynesian model, but they've done so in sort of a particular way. So these are Bewley, Immerhoroglu, Huget, Ayagari style models. So all of the heterogeneity here is what we're going to call ex post. There's no sort of systematic forecastable differences between households. What makes you different from me is that essentially you got unlucky and I got lucky. We got different realizations of an idiosyncratic shock. And in this context, they've shown with numerical methods a really interesting insurance role for monetary policy. But there's all this empirical evidence that ex-ante heterogeneity is also important. So there are a lot of systematic forecastable differences between households in their permanent income skills and their education levels, et cetera. There's a lot of evidence that households have at least some ability to insure over the business cycle. So we think this ex-ante heterogeneity is also important. So what are we going to do in this paper? Well, we're going to characterize optimal monetary policy with inequality in an analytical way, but we're going to do so in the context of ex-ante heterogeneity. So we're going to completely abstract away from idiosyncratic risk and completely shut off the insurance role for monetary policy and just focus on, you can think of sort of just pure redistribution motive. Our framework and our question, well, obviously ex-ante heterogeneity, we're going to have ex-ante differences in households' labor productivity, which we're going to call skill, following Werning 2007. And it's not that these skills are going to be constant, they're going to be state contingent in a fully flexible way. So households' skill levels are going to be changing with the state, and you can think of maybe, the labor income skill of low income households getting much worse over a business cycle shock. However, markets are going to be complete. So we're going to have a full set of state contingent aero securities, and households are going to be able to fully insure against all of their idiosyncratic risk. And so in that way, we're sort of getting rid of the insurance function. Obviously, this is a monetary policy paper, so we need some kind of nominal rigidity. And we're going to do this in the simplest way possible so that everything can be nice and analytical and clean, which is just an information friction. So basically, there are going to be a subset of firms in our economy that are going to be working with last period's information when they're setting prices. We're going to have aggregate shocks, both to aggregate productivity, but also to the aggregate labor skill distribution. And our monetary policy prescriptions are going to depend on what fiscal policy we give our government. And so we're going to give them non-state contingent linear taxes on like a complete set on consumption, labor, revenue, and profits. So these taxes we're going to start out assuming they're just fixed from the beginning of time. They're unable to change at all. We'll relax this assumption and assume that the fiscal government can change the linear tax, but they're always going to be behind. They're always going to be having to change the tax a period in advance. And we're also going to have a uniform state contingent lump sum transfer. So you can kind of think of this suite of fiscal policy as you can cut COVID checks in response to a shock. So you're able to do this kind of blunt, uniform transfer at the business cycle frequency. But in terms of actually like changing the tax code, changing how we set labor income taxes, that's a much slower, less flexible process. And that's kind of what this set of tax instruments is meant to capture. In terms of welfare, right, this is going to be optimal policy. So we're going to have a social planner that's going to put arbitrary Pareto weights on the different household permanent income types. And our question is basically going to be with the tax instruments that I've just presented. So with these tax instruments assumed, under what conditions should monetary policy be used for redistribution, if at all? And if so, how should it be conducted? And in driving our results, we're going to really make clear what the main trade-off is facing policymakers. Just as a high-level preview of the results, we're going to solve for optimal monetary policy and fiscal policy jointly using the primal approach. And we're going to find that when there's no movement in the relative skill distribution, so we're going to say skill shocks are proportional, maybe aggregate skills are going up and down over the business cycle, but as the high income or the high productivity type, you're always making twice as much as me and I'm always making half as much as you. Then that's a sufficient condition for monetary policy to just stick to its traditional role and implement flexible price allocation. So in that case, fiscal policy should just handle all the redistribution. Monetary policy should just target price stability. However, what we think of maybe the more interesting or the more empirically relevant case when shocks actually affect the relative income distribution, so when inequality is actually changing over the business cycle, monetary policy should actually deviate from this traditional role. And in particular, it should target a state contingent markup. So the markup should co-vary with a sufficient statistic for inequality. So we actually have monetary policy deviating from flexible price allocations and responding to changes in inequality over the business cycle. The intuition is hopefully pretty straightforward. So when the monetary authority targets a higher markup in our model, that's going to essentially be an inflation tax on wages. Prices are, increasing faster than wages, so the real wage is going to go down, and it's going to be the high productivity types, the high labor income earners that are going to be sort of more disproportionately hit by this tax. So a higher markup monetary policy is going to have this progressive redistributive quality to it, but the cost is going to be production efficiency. So when we deviate from flexible price allocations, we're going to create price dispersion, and that's going to be an additional cost that we have to weigh the benefits of greater redistribution against. When there are proportional skills, both the marginal cost of like a labor income tax, a labor wedge, and the marginal benefit, which is greater redistribution, are going to be invariant to the business cycle. So the marginal cost of a particular, 20% labor income tax is going to be constant. We're going to keep it at 20%. And if you're always making double what I'm making, no matter where the aggregate economy is, then that power of that 20% tax to redistribute income from you to me is also going to be constant. So when we have marginal cost equal marginal benefit, that's our optimal tax. And in this case, both are constant, and our inflexible constant fiscal policy is actually sufficient. It's optimal. But when inequality is changing over the business cycle, we still have that, this 20% tax has the same, it's creating the same labor wedge, it's creating the same amount of inefficiency. So the marginal cost of this, 20% tax is the same. But if there are states of the world where you are making 4 times as much as me or 5 times as much as me, that same linear tax is going to redistribute more. And so the redistributionary benefit is going to increase. And so we're going to have monetary policy essentially imperfectly substitute for a missing state contingent linear tax. In those periods where there was a lot of inequality, the fiscal policymaker would really like to increase the tax rate. They can't, and so monetary policy is going to fill in imperfectly with this inflation tax. We see ourselves as being related to 2 broad literatures. The first is the primal approach to Ramsey taxation, both sort of the classic original literature with representative agent, but also the more recent literature with household heterogeneity and with nominal rigidity. So we're really combining all 3 of these literatures. And then we see ourselves also speaking to the optimal monetary policy with heterogeneous agents, or monetary policy and inequality literature. But as I mentioned in the introduction, the vast majority or all of the papers presented on this slide think about ex-ante, or sorry, ex-post, idiosyncratic risk and insurance as the form of heterogeneity they're interested in. And we're really deviating by considering this sort of systematic ex-ante heterogeneity. All right, so with that, I'll jump into the model. So time is going to be discrete. We're going to have a finite number of states, and we're going to use the typical notation to denote a history, which is S superscript T. We're going to have a unit mass of infinitely lived households with the following sort of standard homothetic utility function, a mass pi I of each productivity type. So these types are, permanent types. The types aren't changing, even though their actual skill, theta I, is state contingent. So what are households going to do? They're going to consume and pay consumption taxes. They're going to borrow in a 1-period bond B, but also, or save rather, in a 1-period bond B, but also they could buy or sell Z, which are our full set of state contingent aero securities. Given that we have the latter, the former, the 1-period bond is a redundant asset, but we have it there just to be able to price or read off the implied interest rate. And what income do they have? Well, they have the proceeds from their investments from the previous period. They have their after-tax labor income. They have the nominal value of the lump sum transfer, the COVID check that the government's cutting them, which is T. And they also have, right now we're assuming, or we're going to begin by assuming, that they all have an equal share of after-tax profits. That's not going to be an entirely neutral assumption. You might already start, to be thinking to yourself, okay, well, if the monetary authority is targeting this state contingent markup, that's going to change profits. And so monetary policy is going to change asset prices, and we're going to need to think about wealth inequality. And we totally agree. Homogeneous equity shares is going to be sort of our starting assumption, and we're going to relax that later in the talk and talk about how that changes the policy prescription. Firms are going to be pretty standard. We're going to have a mass of monopolistically competitive intermediate good firms indexed by J, and all of their intermediate goods are going to be aggregated by a competitive final goods firm in a very standard way. So this is just typical Dixit-Stiglitz monopolistic competition. And as I mentioned in the introduction, our government is going to be this consolidated fiscal and monetary authority. So to sort of sidestep complications by, setting monetary policy in terms of the interest rate and determinacy issues, we're just going to write down a very simple specification for the monetary policy, which is just the monetary authority choosing the money supply and essentially picking aggregate nominal demand. And then the fiscal authority, as I mentioned previously, are going to levy these constant linear taxes. They're going to issue these state contingent transfers, and they're also going to issue the 1-period bonds and the aero securities. So that's our full environment. It's pretty simple. Just to delve briefly into the nominal rigidity, so we're going to have a fraction 1 minus kappa of our firms be flexible price firms or attentive firms. We're going to be paying attention to the current state of the economy and setting their prices given their knowledge of the current state. And their optimality conditions very standard. It's just a markup over marginal cost. We're also going to have a fraction kappa. The remaining firms are going to be sticky price firms that are going to be inattentive to the current state, and they're going to have to set their prices using information from last period. So they're going to also set their price as a markup over marginal cost modulo this forecast error. Briefly to set some definitions out just for housekeeping. So we're going to call an allocation X, a set of consumption labor for each household type, output and labor demand for each firm, and aggregate consumption. We have government spending, but we're going to set that equal to 0 for the rest of the talk, aggregate output and aggregate labor. And we're going to say that an allocation is feasible if it satisfies the technology and resource constraints. And we're going to call a sticky price equilibrium, so this is going to be the set chi-s, as a feasible allocation along with a set of prices, policies, and financial positions such that all of the usual conditions are satisfied. So the firm's first order conditions are satisfied, the technology constraint is satisfied, the household's problem is satisfied, aggregate nominal demand adheres to monetary policy, and the government budget constraint is satisfied. The sticky price equilibria, these are going to be the set of equilibria that are relevant to us. These are the equilibria that the monetary authority is going to be choosing from when they're optimizing, when they're setting optimal policy. And just for convenience, we'll also define a flexible price equilibrium, chi-f, and this is going to be a subset of sticky price equilibria, essentially where the monetary authority is setting monetary policy to implement flexible price allocations. So with all this sort of housekeeping and definitions done, we can get into sort of what we do. We're going to solve for monetary policy, optimal monetary policy, using the primal approach. So why is this useful? Well, maybe the most straightforward way to solve this kind of a problem, we're going to have an objective function for our planner. We're going to have a bunch of constraints from equilibrium, and we could just optimize the former relative to the latter. But that would require keeping track of prices and policies and financial positions. So the primal approach is this really elegant approach that allows us to characterize the set of all feasible allocations that can be implemented. So all the allocations that we can actually choose from that we're interested in, with necessary and sufficient conditions that only depend on allocations. So this is typically involves just the resource constraint and an implementability condition for each household. So this is essentially subbing in all these first order conditions into the household's budget constraint. And so it's, combining all of these equilibrium conditions into these nice, parsimonious, necessary and sufficient conditions, and then the entire problem can be written only in terms of allocation. It makes the optimization a lot cleaner. Our approach is going to be very similar to the typical primal approach, except for we have two additions or deviations from the typical approach. The first is that we're going to have nominal rigidities and the possibility for monetary policy to deviate from flexible prices, which means we might end up with price dispersion. So we're going to need to take into account the possibility that sticky and flexible price firms are going to be producing at different levels. And obviously, we also have household heterogeneity. So we're going to have multiple household types, which means we're going to need an implementability condition for each of our types. If we were to stop here, all of these implementability conditions would be expressed in terms of just the consumption and labor of that individual household type. We're going to do one more thing to make our lives a little easier and make the derivations a little cleaner. And we're going to take advantage of this really nice result from Warning 2007 that essentially says that any of these equilibria, if it's actually implementable, if it's actually a competitive equilibria, it is the solution to this stylized problem. So we have this hypothetical representative household, and if you said, this is what aggregate consumption is and this is what aggregate labor is, divide up, each individual household's contribution to that aggregate. If this hypothetical household weighted each of the households with what he's calling market weights, then there's a particular set of market weights that would give you any allocation. So if there's a particular allocation where I'm consuming half as much as you, I'm a low productivity type and you're a high productivity type, that allocation corresponds to a world in which this hypothetical planner weights me half as much as you. Why is this powerful? Well, this means that we can rewrite all of the individual household first order conditions in terms of just the representative agents or aggregate labor and aggregate consumption, which is going to make the derivations a lot cleaner. And these implementability conditions are now written in terms of aggregate consumption labor and a market weight for every household, which significantly reduces the number of variables that we have to optimize over. So this is just sort of a nice trick or a nice result to make the proofs a little bit cleaner. So with all of this infrastructure in place, we can talk about which equilibria or what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a sticky price equilibrium. So we can say a feasible allocation can be implemented as a sticky price equilibria as long as we have these set of market weights that are going to correspond to the share that each household is going to have of aggregate consumption and labor. A constant T bar, which is going to be the present value of the entire stream of profits and lump sum transfers, and this calligraphy X, which is going to be our fiscal policy, such that our implementability conditions are satisfied. So if you're familiar at all with the primal approach, this should look very standard. This is a very familiar implementability condition. The only difference is usually for a single household, the right-hand side is 0. Here we have this lump sum transfer. Usually that's ruled out, but the reason why that's still a constraint in our case is we are constricting the right-hand side of these conditions to be the same. So every household gets the same uniform transfer. So we still have a constraint. We can't get to first best. And then also a bunch of constraints on the production side, on the firm side of things. So the first constraint here is essentially our labor wedge. It's saying, what's the difference between the marginal product of labor and the marginal rate of substitution. The wedge between those two is a product of two things. It's X, our fiscal policy, which is a combination of all of the different taxes and the firm's markup. But also the second term, which you can think of as standing in for our monetary policy. So it's the ratio of output from the flexible price firms to aggregate output. If we're implementing flexible price allocations and monetary policy is doing sort of a normal thing, this term is just 1 and it goes away. And it's only when we deviate from flexible price allocations that we introduce this additional monetary wedge. The second constraint here is essentially coming from the sticky price firms' first order conditions. And you can think of this as essentially just imposing rational expectations. So the sticky price firms are going to set their price as a markup over what they expect marginal cost to be, and there's always going to be a forecast error. And this condition is essentially just saying that those forecast errors have to add up to 0. The sticky price firms can't be fooled on average. And finally, we're going to have that all the sticky price firms are going to produce the same amount and all the flexible price firms are going to produce the same amount. So all of these conditions, these are necessary and sufficient for a sticky price equilibrium. So these are going to be the constraints that our planner faces. What is the objective function? Well, our planner is going to maximize the following social welfare function. So it's just going to be the Pareto and population weighted sum of the infinite expected lifetime utility of all the households. So pretty standard egalitarian social welfare function. So we have our constraints, we have our objective function. Now we're actually ready to solve for optimal policy. Before we solve the full problem, though, it's going to be useful to solve a simpler version of this problem, which we're going to call the relaxed Ramsey problem. So we're going to define this set, chi r, as a set of all feasible allocations such that just the implementability conditions are satisfied. So you can imagine it's just the resource constraint, feasibility, and the implementability conditions. Clearly, this is going to be a larger subset of allocations because it's no longer constrained by all of our other constraints. This is essentially equivalent to a standard Lucas-Stokes warning planning problem. And we're going to have this nice result that if we solve for this optimal allocation, so the allocation XR star that optimizes social welfare subject to being in this broader set, that as long as essentially labor income shocks are proportional. So this is the result I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, but aggregate labor productivity, big theta can move around as much as it wants, but as long as you are always making twice as much as me and I'm always making half as much as you, so the shocks are proportional, then it turns out that this optimal allocation can be implemented as a flexible price allocation. There's a constant fiscal policy, and flexible price monetary policy is sufficient to implement this optimal allocation. And because flexible price allocations are all a subset of sticky price allocations, they're just the allocations where monetary policy is essentially getting rid of the forecast error and setting price dispersion to zero, then it turns out that this optimal allocation is also inside of the broader set. So this optimal result of this relaxed Ramsey problem coincides with the actual solution to the Ramsey problem. And again, the intuition really just is that if shocks are proportional, so if I'm always making half as much as you, the optimal labor wedge is constant. Why? Well, the optimal for fixed fiscal policy, the marginal cost of that fiscal policy in terms of inefficiency, in terms of the labor wedge, is constant. But because I'm always making twice as much as you, there is a fiscal policy that coincides with that marginal cost, right? The marginal benefit of redistribution is also going to be constant. So if fiscal policy can implement the optimal allocation, monetary policy should not mess around and introduce any additional production inefficiency. It should just stick to its traditional role and implement flexible prices. Interestingly, this result is robust to the fiscal authority setting the taxes incorrectly. So usually we think, maybe if the fiscal authority is setting taxes correctly and they're doing the appropriate amount of redistribution, there's nothing for monetary policy to do. But a lot of people's intuition would be that, well, if we're under taxing or we're under redistributing, maybe monetary policy can fill in when the fiscal policy makers are sort of doing the wrong thing. And it turns out that that's not true, right? So as long as these skill shocks are proportional, as long as a particular amount of redistribution is going to have the same impact over our business cycle, monetary policy is not going to be able to substitute for missing fiscal policy. And the idea is that monetary policy can't substitute for missing fiscal policy on average, because sticky price firms' forecast error have to be zero on average. So you can think that monetary policy are going to have these real redistributive effects when they sort of surprise firms, when sticky price firms are setting a particular price a period in advance and there's this monetary policy shock. But if monetary policymakers are always shocking in one direction, they're always running the economy too hot or too cold to try to make up for missing fiscal instruments, then the sticky price firms will eventually catch on. You can think intuitively, they're not going to be sort of fooled in all states of the world. And if they didn't sort of adjust their expectations and their prices to the new monetary policy, they wouldn't have rational expectations. So because the monetary authority basically can't fool sticky price firms on average, if the fiscal authority is undertaxing or overtaxing, as long as skill shocks are proportional, there's nothing for monetary policy to do about that. Now we'll characterize what we think is maybe the more interesting case, the more empirically relevant case, where the relative productivity distribution is actually state dependent. So inequality is actually changing over the business cycle, which is the case that kind of motivated the paper. And we're going to define this optimal monetary wedge. So again, this is the wedge between the marginal product of labor, the marginal rate of transformation, and the marginal rate of substitution. So this is our labor wedge. A piece of the labor wedge we're going to attribute to fiscal policy. That's the math cal X there. So fiscal policy is going to be part of the wedge. And we're going to say whatever remains in the wedge that we can't attribute to fiscal policy, we're going to call our monetary policy wedge. So we'll define this sufficient statistic for inequality. It's a little bit hard to see right off the bat just by looking at this, but you can think of this term as increasing whenever already on average high productivity earners get additional labor productivity. So if you are the kind of household that on average is a high earner, if you get additional labor productivity relative to a low earner, this term is going to go up, which is why we're calling this inequality. This is sort of a sufficient statistic for inequality. When people already doing well do better versus when people who are already doing less well do worse, this term is going to increase. It leads to our main result, which is that there's a threshold for inequality. There's a particular labor skill distribution such that if we happen to hit that distribution, this sort of knife edge case, then at that particular level of inequality, the fiscal policy that is set, the optimal fiscal policy, happens to be set such that it was sort of like tailor-made for that level of inequality. So at this threshold I bar, the redistributionary benefit of the fiscal policy exactly equals the labor wedge cost or the efficiency cost. Benefit equals cost, and there's nothing left for monetary policy to do. But as soon as we rise above this level of inequality, so as soon as the already high productivity types get a little bit better off relative to the low productivity types, then we're in one of the states of the world where these high productivity types are earning a lot. We would love to be able to tax them a little bit more, because for a incremental increase in the tax rate, we'd have essentially no change to the marginal cost of increasing tax, but we'd have a massive benefit, right? That little additional bit of labor income tax or labor wedge would have a much larger redistributionary effect. So if we had fully state contingent taxes, we would like to change the tax. We'd like to increase the tax here, but we can't. And so monetary policy is going to fill in for this missing state contingent tax. But again, it's going to introduce production, this new production inefficiency, as it deviates from flexible price allocations, as it deviates from its traditional role. So the optimal monetary tax is going to be set such that the additional cost of the tax in terms of the labor wedge and the additional cost in terms of the production efficiency equal the redistributionary benefit in this new higher level of inequality. So this is kind of our main result. We can talk about implementation, or what it actually means to set this higher implicit monetary tax. And it turns out that that really just means targeting a higher markup. So again, just to sort of repeat the intuition, the markup is going to be price over marginal cost for firms. So it's going to be related to the real wage. And when the markup increases, the real wage goes down. That's essentially an implicit inflation tax on the wages of these high earners. So when we're in a world with unusually high inequality, or inequality that's above this threshold I bar, you're going to want to increase this inflation tax and redistribute away from the especially high labor income earners in that period. So this is our implementation. Yes, so monetary policy should increase the markup whenever inequality increases. We did a very brief numerical illustration. So this is just a very simple version of our model where we have two productivity types, and the parameters are set to very standard levels. And you can see here that as the labor productivity of the high types, the theta H, increases relative to the productivity of the low types, that would increase our statistic I, that would increase our sufficient statistic for inequality, and that would mean that the implicit monetary tax should increase. So here we have like a simple numerical illustration. Yes.
Yes, I have one or two questions, but just one for the moment. So could we include in the skills all the other biases that some people could have? Because I have the impression that you focus on the skills, which is okay. I mean, it's legitimate, and it's on the focus of the paper.
Sorry,
but I just have the impression that some biases. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Not really. The audio is a little bit fuzzy. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Just a minute. Now you can hear me better?
Yeah, that's a little bit better. Yeah, sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So I just have this question about why, I mean, could we include in the skills some other biases that could be stronger than skills themselves? So for instance, you have not only education, but the type of education, or the location, or the experience, or which are not directly related to skills. I don't know, but is it possible to include into your perspective these biases that are not directly related to skills?
Yeah, there's no reason in principle why the types couldn't span like a much broader set of characteristics, certainly. I guess the only thing I'd say is we went with skills because we wanted the relevant statistic or the type to change over the business cycle. So you could call I your education level and your location and your skill level, right? So I could stand in for whatever characteristic you wanted. But then we would still ultimately be interested in how like your labor income changes over the business cycle. So unless we had like an additional variable that would change over the business cycle, so maybe you think like maybe skills are not the relevant metric for inequality. We're going to think about education level and location, and the thing that's going to change over the business cycle is the value of your debt or the value of your nominal positions. I think the model would be totally flexible enough to capture something like that. So basically, you just need to have some kind of income relevant variable, like the value of your assets or your labor skill that's changing over the business cycle, and you need it to change in different ways for these different kind of permanent types. But yeah, as long as you had like a straightforward idea of what you meant by that and which variables you were talking about, I really do think the framework is kind of flexible to handle any way you'd want to write down the types. I think that's actually an interesting idea, because we think that maybe like labor income is not the only thing that changes over the business cycle. So
yeah, okay. And related to the third or fourth slide, maybe I don't remember, when you say that there are people that are not attentive to prices, and so they're index prices to the previous prices, but if prices decrease, then maybe it's a strategy, it's not a question of inattention. I don't remember, you have these two equations where there is an error. Yeah, this one.
Okay.
And I'm asking this question related to skills because here I can see a kind of evident bias of people who want to make money, maybe and so index prices to the past because prices decrease instead of updating prices and decrease those. So I'm just concerned. I'm not concerned, but that's why I'm asking this question, because this kind of forecast error is not necessarily, or this kind of price setting is not necessarily related to the skill, but also to other biases. That's why I'm just asking this question.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure I understand this question. I think, I mean, we just needed to write down the nominal rigidity this way just to have it sort of be as simple as possible. So in principle, any other kind of price setting would probably give us the exact same result. It would just be harder to solve for analytically.
Yeah, exactly. But in the first sentence you mean you put the word attentive.
Yeah.
You know, when you put this word attentive, then you call the attention and the rational intention and the behavioral intention.
Yeah.
And then there is all this behavioral literature that is popping up.
Yes,
So
maybe
that's why I
attentive
asked.
is not the right word here. You know, that's just sort of shorthand that we use, but what we really just mean is that the flexible price firms have access to all the updated information and the sticky price firms don't. So we're kind of completely agnostic as to why there's this information friction, and we're just kind of imposing it. But this isn't like micro-founded in any way. So.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so we have this result that there's this kind of threshold level of inequality where the particular fiscal policy that's set happens to be exactly right, but as soon as we move away from this level of inequality, the redistributionary benefit of an additional, monetary tax or inflation tax is greater than the costs associated with that tax, both the costs of the labor wedge and the production efficiency. And in this case, the monetary authority should deviate and should target this higher markup until the benefits equal the costs. We also have this other sort of result where we're relaxing the pretty strict restrictions that we put on fiscal policy. So in the original result, fiscal policy could not change at all. It was sort of constant for the entire life of the economy. Maybe we think that fiscal policy can change, but it's just maybe with a lag. So Congress will eventually respond to big increases in inequality, but they're not going to do it in real time. It's going to take years for a bill to be passed. So if instead you want to write down fiscal policy as simply being set with a lag, so fiscal policy being set one period in advance, then we can get sort of a stronger, nicer result, which is this implied monetary tax is not just, above a threshold, below one, below a threshold, but it's actually monotonically increasing in inequality. There still is this threshold where it's greater than zero above the threshold. And we actually can write a closed form expression for the local derivative around the threshold. And we can see intuitively that the derivative or the sensitivity of the optimal monetary wedge to inequality is going to be decreasing in rho. And the idea here is that rho is really parameterizing the degree of substitutability between all of our monopolistically competitive firms. And you can think of a bigger rho as increasing the costs of price dispersion. So if rho is very large and these firms are very different, then if they are charging different prices and the sticky price and the flexible price firms are producing very different quantities, that's going to have a larger effect on production efficiency than if the rho was closer to zero. So if we're in a world where the production inefficiency is very costly, is more and more costly, then maybe monetary policy it still, should deviate from flexible price allocations, but it should do so more cautiously. An incremental increase in inequality should lead to a smaller change in monetary policy, because as you go farther and farther away from flexible price allocations, you're getting more and more price dispersion. And as rho grows, that dispersion gets more costly. So we have this nice monotonicity result locally when you can set fiscal policy one period in advance. As promised in the beginning of the talk, so in the baseline model, we have households essentially getting equal shares of after-tax profits. In this section of the paper, we relax that and we say that a household type I gets a share sigma I of after-tax profits, where all of the population weighted shares have to add up to 1. And so the question is, if we have profit shares or equity shares varying in this way, and in particular, if we have them varying in ways that we think are empirically relevant. So what most people think of, which is true in the data, would be, those who have on average higher labor productivity or higher labor earnings. What happens when those people also have, a higher equity share? So our results surprised us a little bit, but I think it's actually pretty intuitive. So we're going to again take the case where fiscal policy can be set just with a lag. So it's not constant, but it's set one period in advance. We're still going to have that the optimal monetary wedge is going to be increasing in I, which is our sufficient statistic for labor income inequality. There's still going to be a threshold. We're calling it I bar sigma. So this is a different threshold, but there will still be a threshold such that the optimal monetary wedge should be positive whenever labor income inequality goes above that threshold. And interestingly, the threshold itself is going to be increasing in this weighted product of the profit share sigma I and nu I, which is the Lagrange multiplier from the planner's perspective on the household I's implementability constraint. It's impossible to see with just looking at this equation, but nu I is increasing for households who have on average higher labor productivity. So if you're a higher labor productivity type, you're on average earning a lot over your lifetime and expectation, your nu is going to be greater. So you can think that if there's this positive covariance between being a high productivity type and having a high labor share, the threshold at which monetary policy should begin to increase the implied labor income tax shifts to the right. And the intuition is, well, here, I'll show you the picture. So here's the same numerical simulation as in the previous case, but we're just going from equal equity shares and moving to the right. We're having the high productivity types go from a 50% share to a 53% share to a 55% share. So as we move to the right, our high productivity types are increasing their equity share. And you can see the threshold at which we should change from an implied monetary subsidy to a monetary, inflation tax on wages shifts to the right. So I think the intuition is actually pretty straightforward. So we are assuming fixed equity shares. So your share of total profits is different, but it's not changing over the business cycle. So sigma I is still constant. When you target a higher markup in order to increase the labor income tax, that's going to be progressive from the labor market side of things, right? It's going to hit high earners harder, but it's a higher markup, which means it's going to increase profits, which means it's going to be regressive on the profit side. So you're sort of with the same lever, you are making labor income inequality better, and you're making wealth inequality or equity inequality worse. And the idea is that over the business cycle, for all the different states, everyone's share of equity is constant. So a particular policy, if it increases profits by 5%, that's always going to have the same sort of negative or regressive effect on wealth inequality or profit inequality. But as labor market inequality gets larger and larger, and that's what that sufficient statistic I is standing in for, as labor income inequality gets worse and worse and worse, the progressive or redistributive power of that same policy is going to get better and better and better. So it's going to get more and more progressive on the labor income side, but it's going to stay the same, in terms of exacerbating wealth inequality. And at some point, the value, labor market inequality could get so high that the value of additional labor market redistribution outweighs the costs of exacerbating wealth inequality. So that's really the intuition for this result, and why, even though having heterogeneous equity shares, as long as you believe they don't change over the business cycle, it changes our threshold. It changes the point at which we should move from a subsidy to a tax. But qualitatively, you still have the same kind of qualitative prescription, which is, as labor market inequality gets worse over the business cycle, you should either make the subsidy less generous or equivalently increase the implied inflation tax on wages. So qualitatively, the results are the same. All right, so I'm a little bit over my 45 minutes, so I'll just conclude. So we have our headline result, which is that when preferences are homothetic and shocks to the skill distribution are proportional, monetary policy should just stick to its traditional role, implementing flexible price allocations. And even totally non-state contingent fiscal policy is sufficient for redistribution. But when the relative skill distribution varies over the business cycle, so the benefit of redistribution varies over the business cycle, we have a missing state contingent tax. And so monetary policy is going to fill in with sort of a state contingent inflation tax that's going to allow the government to increase taxes in states of the world when it's most valuable to do so. So to increase the amount of labor income distribution in states of the world where inequality was really high, and so that additional labor income distribution is very powerful. And this holds even when equity holdings and labor earnings co-vary positively. Again, the exact numerical result changes, but the qualitatively the policy prescription is the same. In terms of next steps for this paper, for this agenda generally, so we would like to do a quantitative exploration. We think that the theoretical results are really nice in terms of their clarity and their intuition, but we would like to experiment with first having sticky wages rather than sticky prices, so having the nominal rigidity on the household side or the worker side rather than the firm side. We think that would make the implementation a little bit more straightforward or a little bit more intuitive. You would still have the monetary authority targeting a state contingent markup, but a markup would be expansionary rather than contractionary. We'd like to look at how the policy prescription, how the slope and the threshold change when aggregate productivity and labor skill or the labor skill distribution co-vary in interesting and maybe empirically plausible ways. And we'd also like to look at what happens when the fiscal authority has progressive taxation. So it's not just constrained to linear fiscal policy. All right, I think that's everything I had, but I really appreciate your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for this excellent paper and fantastic presentation. So there is a lot of things in your paper. I maybe have one question, but for the audience, feel free to raise your hand, and I will give you the floor to ask your question to Wendy about this paper. So I have one question that is very important to us as a central bank, is so now you have this paper. How would you leverage this paper in terms of policy implications? So what would you recommend to a central bank concretely to, according to your results and your model, what would you recommend as policy or to central banks to do or to implement?
Right. So I think the main contribution of the theory. So to be clear, we don't think you can go directly from this paper to a policy, just because there's too many stylized assumptions. So we certainly don't want to suggest that. But I think the power of this paper practically for policymakers is this intuition that even if you set aside the insurance motive and you assume that households can fully self-insure, and you set aside all of those a lot of the motivations that the current research is focusing on, we still have this underlying intuition that our paper provides, which is there are certain states of the world that we think extra taxation is optimal or is more efficient, right? So certain states of the world where we're kind of leaving, we would like to have a state contingent tax, we're sort of leaving additional redistribution on the table. So what I would say to a central banker is the first order of business, we would need to have maybe a more serious or a more quantitative mapping between your monetary policy and the eventual effect on the redistribution. So we have this very simple channel, right? We have a monetary policymaker targeting a higher markup, and that's progressive. So you would need to sort of sit down carefully with a lot of data and figure out when you pull a monetary lever, what is the actual distributional effect? But once you had maybe a sufficient statistic or some kind of relationship between your policy and the income distribution, then you could start thinking about what states of the world would, pulling that lever would, additional redistribution, whatever the mechanism actually is in reality, in what states of the world would additional redistribution be worth a little bit of extra inflation or extra price dispersion. And we hope to sort of take our model to the data and do something like this as sort of like our next project, get the micro foundations and the mechanisms like a little bit more realistic and actually quantify, how bad would labor income over the business cycle have to get for you to consider, a slightly more generous stimulus or something like that. So we are hoping to get a mapping from something like a sufficient statistic for inequality to a policy prescription, maybe this upcoming year. So right now it's maybe a little bit too intuitive or too stylized for policymakers, but I do think our ultimate intuition will hold in a much more rich model. And yeah, I'm looking forward to actually giving you a number maybe next year. So.
Thank you very much. So if we have any question from the audience, please raise your hand or ask a question. So I just have one idea about my question, is maybe two, I don't know. So the first one is, so you talked about taxes and fiscal policy, but in the central bank, so here in Israel, we may advise the government about taxes or stuff like that, but we don't decide taxes. So maybe we have to separate the central bank to the government institution that that determines taxes. But I have an idea about your paper is that, okay, look, we have a certain distribution of skills or income into, let's say, Israel or another country, but in Israel we know and we can map the skills and the income, and maybe your paper could provide us with okay, look how the monetary policy could affect these different distributions of the population. So I think it could be very, very interesting to translate your paper into concrete examples. And I think it's doable. I mean, okay, the data are complex and, but your theoretical framework could bring a very interesting perspective about how we can use, these redistribution, heterogeneity, and heterogeneous agent model into the concrete life of the central bank.
Yeah.
And I mean, and maybe once you focus on the central bank, you may have some adverse effects from the fiscal policy. But because we are not necessarily coordinated with the fiscal authority, so yeah.
Yeah, certainly something that fiscal policymakers could do is make automatic stabilizers a little bit more robust. So that's a question that we do get sometimes. It's sort of not quite correct to say that fiscal policy, at least in the United States, has like no reaction to the business cycle. It has some, just by having a progressive taxation scheme, by having unemployment insurance, we do have all of these responses. But I guess our response to that is, maybe there's no reason to think that automatic stabilizers are sufficient. So if the fiscal policy makers could get closer to having state contingent policy, then our framework would say that monetary policy should do nothing. So, I think I see a hand. Sorry. Let's see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So we have a question from Bad.
Yeah.
Bad?
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me, please?
Yes.
Hello. So
Yes.
I'm Badr from Morocco, an economist and second-year PhD candidate. So before I proceed with my question, I would like to express my gratitude to all vMacro staff, especially my friend Jonathan, and acknowledge Professor Morrison for his contribution today. So my question is, well, Professor Morrison, considering the assumption of your paper as a framework, please can you tell us the potential implication of monetary policy approach for addressing income inequality during different fluctuation of the business cycle, and how might it impact economic stability? Thank you.
So you're basically looking for policy implications?
Yes.
Right. So just sort of like circling back to the previous discussion, we think that the main kind of takeaway from the paper is you don't have to motivate monetary policy playing a redistributionary role with an insurance function. If we were going to take, you can have these ex-ante systematic differences and, complete markets, and there can still be an interesting role. The main policy intuition or policy insight is that there are just states of the world in which it's extremely desirable or extremely efficient to be able to dial up the amount of redistribution in particular states of the world. And you'd want to be able, ideally you'd have fiscal policy that would be able to do that fully flexibly. Monetary policy is sort of like filling in this imperfect way. If we were to actually take our framework or take our model to the data or actually try to come up with a policy prescription, we would have to have a much more serious mapping, I think, between monetary policy levers and the actual change in the income distribution. So right now we have this kind of, it's like, elegant and clean, but it's not a super intuitive implementation, which is we've got sticky prices and flexible wages. And so if the monetary authority contracts, prices stay sticky, but wages fall and the markup increases and the tax increases. So a contractionary event is this, is redistributive in our model. We would probably like to model that differently in a quantitative model with sticky wages. We'd like to take, a quantitative model would have to not just take into account the impact of monetary policy on labor market inequality on average, but, I have a paper about how monetary policy affects the labor incomes of different types of workers over the distribution. Monetary policy also has all these other channels that affects inequality. So McKay and Wolf have a nice paper where they try to add them all up. You know, they go into literature and they say, okay, here are all these different candidates for how monetary policy affects the income distribution. Let's kind of like add them all together and get some kind of incidence function. You know, when we pull this lever, how does it actually affect incomes? We'd have to have some kind of serious mapping like that. So, you know, the first order of business would be to know, okay, when we pull this policy lever, what does that actually do to the redistribution? And then, you know, there's a lot of good research already out there that maps, you know, inflation or price dispersion to welfare costs. So we'd have to have a serious mapping of that as well. And then an ultimate quantitative model would basically tell us, given that if we, you know, increase the interest rate by X%, that leads to, you know, this change in the income distribution or equality, and that also causes, you know, this cost. How bad would inequality over the business cycle have to get for us to sort of adjust our policy for the benefits of this additional redistribution to outweigh the cost? So I guess ultimately our framework is just sort of a theoretical suggestion that such a cost benefit framework is out there. But before we would go to a central banker, we'd actually have to fill in all of the details, and the mechanisms could look very different than what's in our model. We chose them just for simplicity.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Bud, for your question, and Wendy for your reply. So I had also this question. So just a follow-up question about the question of Bud. So I mean, in your paper, it's true that you are focusing on the key nature of optimal monetary policy, that you are optimizing the welfare function and the household welfare. But at the end, we have some financial stability constraints, and they are not necessarily in the same direction than the household welfare. And then what would how your model would behave if some financial instability would appear?
Right. So, you know, in the same way, we would need to take our model to the data and get, you know, a number.
Yeah.
Yep. Sure. You know, you know, you totally think monetary policy affects financial stability, and maybe keeping interest rates really low creates bubbles and, you know, creates financial instability because it pumps up asset prices and stuff. So a full model, if, you know, again, all we're kind of saying, so we have, what do we have? We have one mechanism for how policy affects inequality, and it's just this labor market thing. What do we have in terms of cost? We have like a single cost of incorrect monetary policy, which is price dispersion. And I think a lot of people, and the financial instability channel is also very interesting. A lot of people, you know, see our paper and say, okay, but there are all these other ways that monetary policy affects inequality, or there's all these other costs to doing monetary policy incorrectly. And I think both of us totally agree with that. And so a full quantitative model or like a full policy prescription would need to take, so how would we do it? Okay, so if we have monetary policy, you know, being too accommodative for too long or something, that's going to increase the risk of a crisis or something. Maybe that's the channel you have in mind. You know, what's the impact of that on welfare? You know, what's the consumption equivalent for households to avoid that risk or something? Okay, we put that in the cost column along with price dispersion, along with all the other costs of deviating from kind of traditional monetary policy. And as long as we could quantify those things, we could maybe stand a chance to weigh them against potential benefits. So you're completely right that any serious quantitative attempt would need to try to take into account as many of the pros and cons as possible. So we kind of see our paper as just sort of a framework, just suggesting that such like a cost benefit exists, and it doesn't depend on insurance role for monetary policy. It doesn't depend on excess. Yeah.
That's perfect. Excellent. And maybe last question, if there is no other questions from the audience.
Okay.
I did not see any mechanism that would represent an interaction between monetary policy and fiscal policy in your paper.
Mm-hmm.
Because these two blocks seem to be independent,
Yes.
and in reality, it was main of the concern in the last year. So
yeah, that's true. We don't have any interaction between fiscal and monetary policy. In principle, we could have our we could write down a constraint that generates some kind of interaction. My intuition is that you would still have a similar result, because most of our results really just come from the fact that fiscal policy is not flexible and state contingent. So it can't do the fully optimal thing. It's always a period behind or fixed or something. So it might, if you had it maybe one period in advance, but also monetary policy constrained fiscal policy in some way, that might change the monetary policy prescription. But to be honest, we actually haven't thought about that interaction at all. So that's actually something we should think about. But yeah, thank you. I totally take your point.
great. Thank you very much. I think we don't have any further questions from the audience, so we will close the meeting here. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and very great presentation. Thank you again for being with us, and we wish you a lot of chance and for your research and the job market.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Bye.